Christina Chaviera. Really excited to have her present for us. She's the director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Conference on Holocaust and Education Centers, known as CHEC. We have some CHEC members here today. There's nearly 200 centers and museums around the country, which do many of them bigger than we are, but we all provide this kind of education. And Christina coordinates these centers in the sense that she provides professional development. She runs week-long seminars. I've been there twice, really exciting and very important programming, drawing on the resources of the museum, as you know, which is a prime source of Holocaust education. And also runs weekly regular meetings now online. So many of us who are running centers, we meet with Christina on a regular basis, and she provides program for us. So she's very, very active and helping us do the kind of work that we need to be done. And as you know, probably more important than ever. So we really appreciate the work that Christina and others at the museum do for us. Before Christina has worked with the museum for 14 years out of DC. Before that time, she was director of education for the Houston Holocaust Museum. So she has a lot of experience, obviously, as a Holocaust educator. And one of her field of expertise is around Latin America, which we will hear about today. And she's presented around the country. And as I say, we're very fortunate and thankful to be able to bring her. So without further ado, introduce Christina Chaviera.
Thank you so much, Ron, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to everybody who's here this afternoon, joining this presentation, this discussion on refuge in Latin America. I just want to preface the talk by saying that it has been a silver lining for us to, during the pandemic, to connect virtually with our partners. And the program that I run, the Conference for Holocaust Education Centers, right now we have 48 organizations that belong to it. And this is a program in which the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum works closely with Holocaust organizations around the country to work together to look at the goals of each particular organization, the goals that they have for teacher professional development, and how the museum's resources can help support their goals. But also it's for us to learn when I say us, I mean the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, for us to learn this regional history that many of the organizations have that we don't always know, and to broaden our teacher networks. But it's really to work with the leaders in the field. And the program out of Bristol has been one of the leading centers for several years now. So it's really an honor that we have kept this relationship going for quite a few years. And even before the Conference for Holocaust Education Centers began, we were working together, but now it's in a much more intentional way. And I'm also happy to say that we have representatives from some of the other organizations that belong to CHEC here, from Texas, from Milwaukee, from Philadelphia. And we also have one of our museum teacher fellows who you probably know very well, Howard. So it's really great to see these networks, and this is the way that the museum interacts, not only with teachers directly like Howard, but also with organizations around the country that support teachers. So I also want to just say that we are closed right now temporarily. I'm not sure when we're going to reopen, but I know that we are working on it. We reopened for a little while, but then there was a spike in cases in Washington, D.C. And the mayor said that all of the museums had to close for a time. But we are working to reopen. But like so many, because we're not open to the public physically, we have a very robust presence online. And We're not only working with our Holocaust education partners through CHEC, but we are also providing a lot through social media, through creation of resources, supporting teachers, supporting students, supporting military programs. We've been able to expand our audience just as many other organizations have done in this time. And so hopefully we'll be able to do so even when we open back physically. So we do invite you to come to Washington as soon as we reopen, and come to the museum if you haven't visited already. We would love to see you, and we will continue to work together no matter what. So thank you again to Ron for this gracious invitation. And I want to say thank you to Gary, because Gary, you're really in charge of everything now. It's all in your hands. So thank you for running the tech. So if Gary's going to put up the PowerPoint, and I'm going to share some images with you and some film footage based on our archives. So if we can start from the very top, actually the second slide is good. So the museum, we are focused on this central question. For the first 10 years that the museum was open, we were focused very much on the history, just learning the history and knowing the facts. And then we went and moved to, I'm not sure if you can start the PowerPoint, if you're able to do so. Gary? Oh, at the bottom right there, the little icon, the little podium. Right. Yeah, over down here. If you see where my cursor is.
No.
Okay, it's right. It's right. No, you can't see my cursor. Okay. Okay, if you go down where it says notes and the red bar at the very bottom, go to the red bar at the bottom of the PowerPoint. There's a red bar at the bottom. No, down beneath the notes.
Way down.
Way down.
I don't see it. So
Okay, you know what? Why don't let me see if I can just pull up my
Bottom of the screen.
yeah,
Like a
it
red-
says
like a red bar. at
okay,
the very
keep
bottom.
going down. Yes, you
Yeah,
just
down,
hit-
down,
okay,
down.
see where it says
Down
no?
there it says no.
okay.
Okay, so right next to, go over two more to and you'll see a little podium, the next one right there. There you go.
Oh, okay. I got you.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, that's no problem. Okay, so if you click, I think we're starting, you know what, if it's easier, I can just run it. That's fine. Yeah, because we got to go back to,
We're all set.
okay. So if we go to the next slide and click one time. So the museum is concerned with answering this question, how and why did the Holocaust happen? And we know what happened, we know what took place, but what led to the Holocaust and why? The why question is one that we will probably be answering for all time, but we use our resources in our tremendous archive to look at what led to the Holocaust. What were the warning signs? What was the framework in which we understand how genocides happen? So this is a very central and important question to us, so that we can look not just again at the killing, but what led to the erosion of democratic principles. And that's one of the reasons why we are on the National Mall. We are on federally donated land. We are federally funded. And we are on the National Mall because when visitors come to Washington, D.C., and they're seeing all of these monuments to American democracy, like the Washington Monument there, we want them to be reminded that democracy is fragile and that we cannot take it for granted. And that is something that we've probably seen become much more relevant in the last few years, and especially in the last few months, in what happens in January here on the mall, just 4 miles down from where I live. And so for us, that this is a very central question, and our location is really central to why we exist. So if you click one more time. Why didn't European Jews leave the continent and go elsewhere? When we work with educators, we encourage them to complicate students' thinking, to really get at those complex questions and unpack them. So when students ask how and why did the Holocaust happen, we cannot give them the simple answer of saying anti-Semitism or racism, but we have to look at so many other factors. Of course, those play huge roles in this, but because somebody harbors beliefs doesn't mean that they're going to turn to genocide. So we have to really look more broadly at this history and contextualize it. And one of the questions that our visitors and students often ask is, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they go somewhere else? If things were so bad, why did they stay? So that's what part of this presentation is going to address today. I know that when we hear about Latin America, a lot of us tend to think about the perpetrators who went there. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're really focusing on the refugees who needed a place to go, whose lives were in danger, and primarily European Jewish refugees. So this will hopefully help us to better understand what the obstacles were toward leaving. So if we click one more time, and also the global responses. So the museum, even though we are a national museum, we are also a global institution. And because we collect records from all over the world, it is very important for us to understand and to disseminate information on the global impact that the Holocaust had. So if we click one more time, what were those challenges and opportunities for refuge in Latin America? We know that there were great obstacles to leave Europe. We'll talk about that in a bit. But what did certain countries in Latin America represent? What could they provide? But also, what could they not provide? Or what were some of those bigger challenges and those obstacles to going there? So I just want to start off by saying that when we think of Latin America, we shouldn't think about one country. We need to remember that Latin America consists of several countries. And so it is kind of a question of picking and choosing which countries we're going to focus on. And the reason why I'm focusing on the countries that we will talk about today is because they either had a bigger history, they played a bigger role, and or because we also have records from those countries. So if we go to the next slide and click one more time, actually twice, we have a very robust program, our International Archival Project. These are my two colleagues, the taller man, the tallest man, Anatol, and then to the far right, Henry Mayer, Anatol Steck and Henry Mayer. They are two of my colleagues who have made several trips to South America to retrieve records on the Holocaust. We try to what we call rescue the evidence all around the world. And these can be personal records, personal archives, all the way up to the records of a particular country, a particular government in which they've opened up their records for the 1930s and 40s, for us to try to understand what their views were, what their policies were on immigration, if they had a refugee policy. So we are trying to build and preserve the fully accessible collection of record on the Holocaust. And we have made available on our website, you can do a collection search and you will find untold numbers of documents. And we still haven't finished digitizing everything, but we are trying very hard to make records available because we know most people can't come to the museum, but we want to make it possible for you to do research online. So almost everything that you'll see today, you can find online. So if we go to the next slide, Right now, we have this incredible exhibit called Americans in the Holocaust, though unfortunately, because we are closed, we cannot visit it. But the reason why I chose this particular slide is because one of the things that we do with this exhibit, which looks at how we responded to the Holocaust, what we knew, what could Americans have known at that time, and there was a lot more than a lot of us were commonly led to believe. What kind of access to information did we have? And what could Americans have done? And one of the central issues with this exhibit is about immigration and the refugee crisis of the 1930s. And this particular picture deals with that part of the exhibit. When you come and you visit, you will go to this central room and you will see this interactive table, and you can see 9 different stories of individuals who are trying to come to the United States. Some are successful, some are not. And it looks at the context of the times. And as it says there, these were desperate times, but there were very limited measures. So we're going to take part of that lens and apply it to some Latin American countries. So if we go to the next slide, where do we begin? You can begin even earlier than 1938, but for the sake of time, we're going to start with 1938. And the reason why we start with 1938 is because 1938 is considered to be that turning point year. There are many things that happened in 1938 that made a significant impact on the outcome of the Holocaust. And you had some very significant events, if you can go back, yes, thank you. You had some very significant events, starting with the Anschluss in March of 1938, because everything that had been enacted against German Jews now is happening basically overnight. The position of the Jews of Austria became very precarious, not in the slower period that it took Germany, but it happened very quickly in March of 1938. And this is really critical for cities like Vienna, where about 10% of the population was Jewish. And now all of these anti-Semitic decrees are now falling on them. And this is when you start to see the rise in visa applications because of the events of 1938. Now, there were people who were trying to get out of the Third Reich, which was largely Germany in those prior years and parts of Czechoslovakia. But 1938 really signals a huge shift and a huge uptick. And that's when the beginning of this refugee crisis begins because of the violence. And if you look at the picture on the right, these are Viennese Jews waiting in line to try to secure visas. This is after the annexation of Austria. So if we go to the next slide, the Blumenstein family. So one of the things, as I mentioned, that we do is we collect records from individuals and from families as well. And this archive is a particular favorite of mine. This was a family from Vienna. They were Jewish. We have letters, we have State Department correspondence, we have correspondence from the various countries where the father, Franz, who's holding the little boy Heinz, standing next to his wife Elsa, correspondence and trying to secure visas and then trying to find out where family members are. And this is his date book. This is Franz's date book. Franz owned a perfume factory, and the Anschluss began on March 12th of 1938. And if you look closely at the bottom and see what he has written, he even writes Santiago de Chile. So he's starting to consider, where can he go? This is not going to be good. They know, they've seen what's happened to the Jews of Germany, and now this is going to happen to them, and it's going to happen rather quickly. So where can he and his family possibly go? Little Heinz is only 3 years old at this point. He was born in 1935. So if we go to the next slide, the Evian Conference. what happens after the Anschluss is that uptick, as I mentioned, the uptick, a very huge spike in visa applications from European Jews trying to go basically anywhere. We see that in the United States, where the visa applications in Germany, Austria, and the Czech Republic are really rocketing. And so the Evian Conference, which was held in Evian, France in July of 1938, it was convened by President Roosevelt, although he himself didn't attend, nor did anybody from his administration. But 32 countries sent representatives to this conference, with the caveat that they would not be asked to increase their quotas and take in more refugees than they were already doing. So basically it was, it was written already what the outcome might be, except for one country, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later. One country stepped forward and said that it would increase its quota by 100,000, and that was the Dominican Republic, and that was under Rafael Trujillo. And we'll talk about the reasons behind that. But keep the Evian Conference in mind and the Dominican Republic in mind, because it does play into the story of the Blumenstein family. So if we go to the next slide, this is another factor that will gravely impact the Blumenstein family, as it did thousands of others in the German Reich at the time. So Kristallnacht was it's referred to as the Night of Broken Glass. It was an organized pogrom. Pogrom is organized violence against Jews. And this happened November 9th and 10th of 1938. And this was considered to be basically the turning point of 1938, in this year of turning points. And why was it a turning point? Because this was the first time that organized violence that was called for from the very top took place in a matter of 2 days, and attacks on the Jews in the German Reich, which has grown after the Anschluss of Austria. And the Blumenstein family is impacted because their business is lost, their perfume factory, and Franz, the father, is one of the thousands of Jewish men who is rounded up, and he is sent to Dachau. He is arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Now, before this, most of the people who were sent to concentration camps, starting in 1933 with Dachau, were political opponents. But this is the first time that you see Jews arrested because they are Jewish, and Franz is one of them. And by this point, his wife, Elsa, she's desperate to get him out. And she's able to do so, like many others, by finding a way to get him out of the country. Many of the men are released on the condition that they will leave the Third Reich, and they will go elsewhere to live. But remember that the Evian Conference was really a failure. So where do you go when the doors are closing to you? And this is where we start to understand why they couldn't just leave, because of the severe restrictions in immigration in many countries. And the Great Depression, of course, plays a role in all of this too. So she is able to gather enough money to secure passage for him on a boat called the Königstein, that's going to go to Trinidad and Tobago. But she and their little boy cannot leave because they don't have enough money for all of them to go, because they have lost their business. But he has to leave because he's already been arrested. So if we go to the next slide. This is his date book again in early 1939. She is able to help him get out in January of 39 from Dachau. And if you look at his date book, if you look closely, you can see a lot of South American, Latin American places, Guyana, Caracas, he even mentions Puerto Rico. He's trying to find a place to go. And he's able to secure, with Elsa, he's able to go on the Königstein, the boat that you see pictured on the right, that made several trips across. and it was going to go to Trinidad and Tobago. But what happens to him when it gets to Trinidad and Tobago? They refused entry to them. And they had already, there had been another boat that had gone to Barbados, the Caribia, that was also refused entry to Barbados. So you have a lot of ships at this time where you see the situation, and this sounds very familiar to a lot of us who know the history of the St. Louis. The St. Louis, that story was very atypical for the United States, but boats being refused entry into Latin American countries overall was not something unusual. And so this happens to Franz, where now they are basically stuck. And what happens was that the boat goes to Venezuela. The Caribia, which had sailed a month before from Barbados, it left Barbados, it did go to Venezuela. And the Jewish community of Venezuela, the Ashkenazi community, because the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi communities were very divided at the time, they took them in, but they didn't have enough money to raise funds to pay for their entry for the passengers on the Königstein. So the Königstein was about to go back to Europe when a member of the Sephardic community, Fortunato Benacerraf, he was a banker, he came forward and he actually was friendly with the president of Venezuela at the time. And he helped to persuade him to allow them to stay, at least temporarily. This made a lot of news in the Venezuelan papers, that there were more refugees that were coming in. And there was a great deal of concern because of the prospect of these refugees taking over jobs, or at least competing for jobs, which were few and far between. And the only jobs that were really open to them were a lot of more manual labor, whereas many of the passengers were well-educated and had worked white-collar jobs in their previous life in the Third Reich. So what happened was they were able to stay. And if we go to the next slide, one of the things that we've learned is that even though they were given refuge for a time, it was not easy for them. They were sent about 40 miles outside of Caracas, out in the country where they were not used to the humid weather. It was very unsanitary, the conditions, there wasn't enough food to eat. So the Venezuelan Red Cross actually steps in. And so keep in mind that Franz is now part of this group. So we're gonna, if we can, yes, there you go. We're gonna watch this film footage. And it doesn't have any audio. It's all just video.
Yeah, it says cannot play.
Okay, let me
So
let me go on ahead and I will do a screen share here.
Oh, let me get out. All right.
Oops. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And what I'm going to show you is some film footage that was, it doesn't have any audio, but this comes to us from the David Glick collection. These are refugees in Venezuela. And this was filmed by a man named David Glick. David Glick was an American attorney who was sent by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to report on the situation of the refugees that the Joint had helped to sponsor to go to South America. Here they are outside of Caracas. These are the passengers from the Königstein. The wife of the president of Venezuela, President Lopez Contreras, she actually helped to set up these soup kitchens with the Venezuelan Red Cross. So David Glick visited 11 countries in South America and wrote a report on each of the countries. And he found that there was a lot of corruption, that a lot of the money that the Joint had given to help the refugees resettle was not being used for its intended purpose. And so there was a lot of discussion also too about how some of the communities were fractured, especially between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic community. And here you see this is Ecuador, you probably recognize it. One of the things that's really striking about this film footage is that we see the refugees living in climates and in geographies that would not have been familiar to most of them. I mean, I've been to Europe several times. I've never seen a cactus in Vienna or in Berlin or so this signals to us that these places are very different and they could be even problematic at this time for some refugees. If you are elderly, if you have health conditions, you might find it very hard to breathe because some of these countries have a very high altitude, like Bolivia. The climate, again, just the tropical climate of some of these countries, either very humid or very arid, those also played a factor. But at the same time, the refugees who went there, we have to remember that they survived because they did. This is David Blick leaving a train station in Peru. You see some of the refugees in there, but it's mostly the community, which is largely, from this particular community, largely indigenous. So I think, I can just continue to share from my screen. That's fine. So Franz goes to Venezuela at first because he's on the Königstein and it gets taken in by Venezuela. But he then goes to Cuba. And he goes to Cuba because his sister had already gone to Cuba ahead of him. So he went to join her. And while he's there, he's able to receive permission from the Cuban government that his wife and his son, who are stuck in Vienna, they can now come and join him. And he's able to purchase tickets for them on a boat called the St. Louis. And some of you might know this history. Now, this is a picture of his wife, Elsa, on the St. Louis. And we know what happens with the St. Louis. For those of us who are familiar with this history, we're going to watch a short video. And then I will explain that newspaper. I'm going to stop here right now because I've got to move to a different screen. Okay, can everybody see this screen, Refugee Ships at Sea?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So we're going to watch this in two parts. This is on our website, and we're going to see what the history of the St. Louis was. And we're also going to see that there were many refugees, at least over 100,000, who arrived in New York between 1938 and 1941. So we have to remember that the St. Louis was not your typical story. There's this mythology around the St. Louis as though it were the only boat that ever came to the US and that it was turned away and we took in no refugees, which wouldn't explain the fact that some of us might even be the children or grandchildren of refugees who were able to come here before the war or during the war. So let's watch this video. It's a short clip, but it gives you the history and it also shows you how boats are arriving in New York at the same time.
On May 13, 1939, the MS St. Louis, a German passenger ship, began its journey from Hamburg to Havana, Cuba. The ship carried 937 passengers. Most were Jews seeking temporary refuge in Cuba as they waited for immigration visas to the United States. When the ship arrived in Havana, most of the passengers were not allowed to disembark. They had unknowingly purchased fraudulent landing permits from a corrupt Cuban government official. The ship sat in the harbor for nearly 1 week while a relief agency called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known as the Joint, tried to persuade the Cuban government to admit the refugees. After negotiations broke down, the ship steered toward Miami, Florida. The refugees and their supporters on land appealed to the public, the press, and even to President Roosevelt and the First Lady. The president never responded, and the State Department did not take any measures to admit the St. Louis passengers. As the ship crossed the Atlantic on its return to Germany, the Joint's European director, Morris Troper, worked tirelessly with State Department staff in Western Europe to find safe havens for the passengers. Troper's last-ditch efforts were successful. 4 Western European countries, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, issued entry visas to the St. Louis passengers. They would not be forced to return to Nazi Germany. But the passengers were not safe from future danger because Nazi Germany soon invaded 3 of the countries where they had landed. Many of the passengers were still on the waiting list for U.S. immigration visas 1 year later. But immigration to the United States was nearly impossible. Of the 937 passengers on the St. Louis, 254 were murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during World War II.
Okay, so Elsa and her son are on the St. Louis. Elsa and little Heinz are on the St. Louis. And Franz is actually able to go out on a flotilla and talk to them as they're on the ship, on the deck, and just wish them, just tell him he's trying very hard. He's doing everything he can. And when the boat goes back, they are given refuge in the Netherlands. And we have a project right now that's called History Unfolded, in which we are asking members, anybody who's interested in doing this kind of research, to research your local newspapers, the archives, whether you can find them online. Many newspapers have been digitized, or if you're able to go to a library in this time and look up through microfiche. And this was a picture of the Jewish Floridian, which was published in Miami, writing about the St. Louis, reporting on the St. Louis, because it was basically right there off of Miami Beach as all of this was happening. So Elsa and Heinz go back to the Netherlands. They're giving refuge there, but we have to remember that, as the film points out, the Netherlands was overtaken by Germany in 1940, and Elsa and little Heinz they become enemy aliens, and also doubly so because they are Jewish. And at one point, Heinz is with his grandmother because she was also with them, and they come to take them, they come to arrest them, and the grandmother hides, she shoves little Heinz into a cabinet, and she is taken, and she's taken to Ravensbrück, and she perishes. And he's in hiding, and his mother finds him, but she, Elsa, makes the very difficult decision that she needs to find a separate hiding place for her son, because she realizes if they're together and they get caught, both of them would be doomed. And if they separate, at least one of them will survive. And she's actually correct about that, which I will talk about in a minute. So we also are collecting newspapers published in the United States from the Spanish language press. And these are three newspapers. This is one from the Brownsville Herald, El Heraldo de Brownsville, which is in Texas. It was front page news about the voyage of the St. Louis. El Mundo in San Juan, Puerto Rico, also reported on the voyage of the St. Louis on its front page. And La Opinión, I know we have at least one person here from California. La Opinión is still published today, and this was the front page of the newspaper that's published in Los Angeles. So you can see that the St. Louis was actually widely reported also too in some of the bigger English language newspapers in the US as well. So what happens to the family? So Elsa and Heinz are in the Netherlands, and remember that the Dominican Republic at the Evian conference, the Dominican Republic made this very kind of grandiose gesture and saying that they would take in 100,000 refugees. Now, if you've been to the Dominican Republic and you know its history, there wasn't any large Jewish community there. It is still very tropical, and at the time, a lot of the land wasn't settled. And more importantly, the Dominican Republic had just come out of some very, very sad press and sad news. And because Trujillo, who himself was a murderous dictator, he had ordered the massacre of thousands of Haitians in the DR in 1937. And there was a huge international outcry against him. So basically his move to take in 100,000 refugees wasn't out of humanitarian concerns. It was because he needed to rehabilitate his image on the international stage. But the United States is behind this idea that the refugees should go there and go other places and not necessarily come to the US. And in this particular case, the United States and the Joint Distribution Committee helped to give money to the Dominican Republic Settlement Association, or DORSA. And this was run by two men who had worked very hard to help establish kibbutzes in what was then Palestine, Eretz Israel. They took their expertise in farming and agriculture and brought it to the Dominican Republic. Trujillo himself donated land in the northern part of the island called, it was a banana plantation in a little town called Sosua. And so Franz, the father, goes to the Dominican Republic. He's one of a few hundred refugees who's able to go there. And he is hopeful that he can receive visas because of the 100,000 people promised to be saved. He's hoping that he will secure visas for his wife and son to join him in Sosua. So here we see him very different from what he looked like in the previous picture in Vienna. He did not have any agricultural experience, but it was something that many were desperate to learn, because many of these countries, as I mentioned before, they did not want white collar workers competing for jobs in the cities. They wanted immigrants, and they would take in people if they were willing to go to the outskirts of the countries and if they were willing to take agricultural jobs. We see this in many of the countries in Latin America. That's one of the major provisions. So here he is doing things that are very different from his life in Vienna. He's picking bananas. He even won a prize for learning how to milk cows and milking the most cows of anybody in this one contest. And he is able to secure visas for his wife and son to come to the Dominican Republic. The tragedy is that by the time he was able to do so, they could no longer secure exit visas to leave Germany, because the consular offices were ordered to close in 1941. And by October of 1941, you could no longer legally leave any part of Nazi-occupied Europe to come to the US. Your best bet was if you could escape and go to the parts of Europe that were not occupied and try to get to a consular office there, which they were not able to do. Tragically, Elsa is discovered in hiding, and she is sent to Westerbork, where Anne Frank and her family were sent, and then she's sent to Auschwitz, and she is murdered in Auschwitz. Little Heinz is hidden by a Christian family, the Dykstra family, and he is kept safe and he is loved by them. And he and his father are reunited in the United States in 1946. He changes his name to Henry, and he donated all of the family papers and photos to the museum several years ago. And sadly, he passed away only 2 weeks ago, just a little north of where I live in Silver Spring, Maryland.
Huh.
So he just passed away, the little boy, Henry Heinz. But he gave us this incredible trove of information. And my interest in it was because of what it reveals about Latin America, which is a lot. But these are some other pictures that we have from our archive. No, the SS does not stand for the SS as we know it. This is Servicio de Sosua. That's what it stands for. And it's Servicio de Leche. These are refugees delivering milk and bananas. And again, just the contrast with their life and their livelihoods, and how different it was. And I want to include this picture because this is a little more hopeful. This is a picture of a pre-kindergarten class at La Escuela Cristóbal Colón, the Christopher Columbus School in Sosua. These are children born to the refugees who went to Sosua. Some of the children in this picture are products of mixed marriages. The refugees, they took in mostly men. There were not a lot of women refugees coming over at the beginning. And Sosua almost failed because of the lack of expertise and because it was so difficult to till the land. And it wasn't land that was really productive for agriculture, as it turned out, but they were able to succeed. And so many of the men ended up marrying local women and having children with them. And even today, the dairy production, the company is still producing cheese and other dairy products. And there is a small museum dedicated to this history in Sosua. Most of the refugees left after the war. And in the end, the Dominican Republic issued less than 5,000 visas. And while most of the people who received these visas probably never went to the Dominican Republic, it did help many of them at least get out of Europe because they could show they had a place to go. So now we're going to look at Argentina, which is the country that probably had the bigger history in all of the Latin American countries at this time. A lot of us think about Argentina with the perpetrators who went there, which is absolutely true. But for the purposes here, we're looking at Jewish refugees trying to go to Argentina. So Argentina had a very liberal policy in immigration starting in the latter part of the 19th century as a result of the pogroms in Argentina trying to build up its business acumen. Argentina felt that if they took in Eastern European Jews and required them to live further away from Buenos Aires, that it would help boost the economy. But most of them ended up moving to places like Buenos Aires, Córdoba, some of the bigger cities. And so for several years, Argentina did take in a lot of Eastern European Jewish refugees who were fleeing the pogroms. And that is why today Argentina has the 7th largest Jewish population in the world. It's about 250,000. At the time, in the 1930s, there was about 274,000. And this is a picture from the Yafa Eliach collection, Eshishak. If you visited the museum here in Washington and you've walked through the Tower of Faces, the 2 floors where you see thousands of photos of a community, a shtetl in Eshishak that had a 900-year history that was wiped out in 2 days. This photo is from that collection. This young man was from there, but he was able to leave in 1934. He went to Argentina, lured by the promise of having a secure job and moving to a more modern society. Argentina was thought of and still is thought of today. It's often referred to as the Paris of South America. It had a large established Jewish community. There was a very robust and still is a very robust Jewish life that's also very integrated in Argentina. So he sends home this postcard to his parents for Rosh Hashanah. He sends it back to Lithuania. Tragically, his parents did not survive. But he did because he had gone earlier to Argentina. And now we look at the more sinister history of refuge in Argentina. On our left-hand side is Directive Number 11. This was for decades a document that people knew about, but nobody could find. And in 2005, a historian who was doing some research at the Argentine embassy in Sweden found a copy of this directive. This directive was issued around the time of the Evian conference by Argentina. It was sent to all of its embassies in Europe. It's basically saying, do not let in refugees. And it was really aimed at not letting in Jewish refugees. This document caused a huge uproar when it was found in 2005, because some of the diplomats that had previously been praised as Argentinian heroes, as rescuers, not recognized by Yad Vashem necessarily, their names had to be taken off of plaques and such because it was found that they were behind this directive. Over on my right-hand side, and I apologize, it's a little dark, this is another document that was issued by Argentina to its embassies in Austria, Germany, and Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. Basically, this is a list of everything that refugees, immigrants, anybody who wants to come to Argentina, it's a list of everything that they need to do and everything they need to provide. And it's very cost prohibitive for them. It's very similar, it's in Spanish, but it's very similar to what we have when we look at what you needed to come to the United States. It was almost impossible by this point to put together and to gather all of the documentation and the money that you needed if you wanted to go to Argentina. These two documents will be in an updated lesson plan that I'm working on that we hope will be out soon in the next 2 or 3 months to teach about Latin America. So this is also one of those documents that I just find very fascinating because it raises a lot of questions about Argentina. Argentina, one of the reasons why it barred Jewish immigration by 1938 was because Argentina saw itself as a Catholic country. It is still very largely Catholic, very conservative. So they wanted Catholics, not Catholic refugees. They tended to probably take in more people from Spain or Italy, and that's why you see many people of Italian descent who are Argentinians, because of Catholicism was a strong reason. And yet this is a sign posted by a store owner who closed their shop in response to Kristallnacht. This is from Buenos Aires, and the sign says, somos católicos, and we are Catholic, we feel the pain of our Jewish brothers. So we don't know what kind of relationship this store owner had. Maybe he or she or they were friends and had friends in the Jewish community. Remember, Argentina had a large Jewish community already. This also raises questions about how people could protest. We think a lot of times when students ask us, what can we do to fight genocide and human rights abuses today from where we stand? And this person, whoever hung this sign, is one of those people who is taking a stand. We don't know why specifically, but if you are seeking to go to Argentina and you see a picture like this and you hear about how some people, because of their Catholicism, they want to help you, you might want to try to go to Argentina, even against the odds of being let in. So we have a lot in our archives from Argentina, and it's really fascinating to see. A lot of people wanted to go to Argentina and they had to go through Bolivia, which I'm going to talk about next. But just before that, even though Even though officially immigration was barred, you still had some people who were able to secure these certificates of immigration because they promised to work in agriculture. And you see the Minister of Agriculture issuing these certificates. And we have a whole series of them, which really kind of goes against what we know about the official immigration policy. Some people were able to come through because they promised to work in immigration. And we saw a lot of people who first went to Bolivia in the hopes that they could make it to Argentina, which is what I'm going to show you now. So Bolivia is a really fascinating story. And per capita, Bolivia took in the most amount of Jewish refugees per country in Latin America. Even though it's a small country, it had almost no Jewish community before. It took in at least 30,000 Austrian Jews and then several thousand Jewish refugees from other countries, primarily from Poland and a lot post-war too. Today, the Jewish community numbers less than 1,000. Most of them left. Leo Spitzer, who was a historian up in Maine and is still in Maine, he's retired. Leo is in this picture. His mother is 7 months pregnant with him. And this is the family, the Spitzer family. They were from Vienna. This is where they left Vienna. They were able to go to Italy, and from Italy, they were able to sail first to Chile. Many of the boats went to Chile. And then from Chile, they were able to catch a train that was nicknamed the Judío Express, the Jewish Express, that took them to La Paz, Bolivia. So this was in July of 1939. This is 18 months later. This is Leo. I just saw him last week in a video call. He donated this trove of family photos of their life in La Paz in Bolivia. They did not stay there after the war. They left. And as I said, he's a historian. He's retired now, but still very active in Latin American Jewish study circles. This is a picture of him playing with his neighbor. And this picture raises some questions. It says a lot about children. And when we think about children and how people learn to hate. Many of the refugees who went to Bolivia, if you've read their testimonies, some of them were very racist against the indigenous people. It was a shock to many of the refugees because they had not known anybody who was indigenous in Europe. They were not used to the way they lived. Many of them consider them to be dirty, having no manners. And yet you see this picture of these two children playing together, and you see he's well-dressed, very European style of clothing. And this little girl, she's basically in tatters and she's barefoot. But yet this is his little companion. And so Bolivia, why Bolivia? How were they able to go to Bolivia? Largely because of one individual, a German Jewish mining magnate born in Germany, but he moved to South America, and he played a very big role, not only in refugees going to Bolivia, but also to Chile and to Argentina. And his name was Morris Hochschild, or Mauricio, as he went by in South America. Mauricio Hochschild was able to convince the president of Bolivia. Bolivia suffered tremendous losses in the Chaco War of 1935 against Paraguay, and it decimated business, the economy in Bolivia. So Hochschild, who was friendly with the President Bru, was able to convince him that if they brought refugees, Jewish refugees over, this was in 1938, 1939, they could help to boost the economy. They could help to work in business, expand the mining business. So Hochschild actually did hire a lot of the refugees and found jobs for them. He's somebody that I think we need to learn more about with this history. He was actually condemned to die by the Bolivian government. Later on, he was considered to be a spy, and even there was a lot of question about him, but they overturned that sentence. He had to leave Bolivia forever. He died in Paris. He's actually buried at the Père Lachaise Cemetery. That's very famous there in Paris. But he plays a very large role in this history with Latin America. And he was a significant reason why the Spitzer family and many others were able to go to Bolivia. So here's the Spitzer family. Leo's in the carriage. We can't see him, but he's in there. And again, this raises questions about just the geography. Bolivia was one of those countries that if you were elderly or if you had a lot of health issues, you probably weren't going to get a visa to go there because it has the highest altitude. And the picture on the right is the Altiplano. That is like the highest point in sea level in Bolivia. And many of the refugees did report that they had breathing problems, they had nosebleeds, it was just very arid, they felt parched all the time. And it was one of those countries that a lot of the refugees at first had no idea what Bolivia was. One of my favorite quotes was from a refugee who said, you know, I had to go to the library in Vienna and look up Bolivia in an atlas because I had no idea where Bolivia was. It would have been better for me to go to the moon, he said, because as he said, he saw the moon every night. He knew where the moon was, but Bolivia was a place that was just so foreign to him, but it ended up saving his life. Mexico is a very different situation than most of the other countries. At this time, it had the only democratically elected government. And this is a picture of President Cárdenas with the children of Spanish Republicans. And I included this picture because the Spanish Republicans were probably a significant reason why some European Jewish refugees were able to go to Mexico as well. Mexico was probably really the only liberal country in south of the Rio Grande at this time. Whereas the other countries tended to be very conservative, very right-wing, Mexico was very leftist as a result of the Mexican Revolution. And there are a lot of connections between the Mexican Revolution and the immigration policies that Mexico set up as a result. Mexico wanted Spanish Republicans to come over. Mexico at first had a very open policy, but by 1934, it started to change. And when the Spanish Civil War began, Mexico felt that it should take in refugees and immigrants who had fought for democratic causes abroad, namely thinking of Spanish Republicans who fought against Franco. Mexico also wanted Spanish Republicans because they were more culturally similar. They were more of a Latin mentality, perhaps. They spoke Spanish. And even though Mexico at that time had become very anti-clerical, very anti-church, and Spanish Republicans, a lot of them were leftists, communists, and maybe atheists, they still had that cultural Catholicism background that they shared. So Mexico was, interestingly enough, it was the only country in the League of Nations that openly opposed the Anschluss, that actually formally issued a declaration against the Anschluss. So Mexico has always had a very interesting relationship with Austria, dating back to Emperor Maximilian. So you do see a lot of connections there between Mexico and Austria. So this also is something that I think is very telling because Mexico, as I said, it did have a strong anti-Nazi movement against the Golden Shirts. This was the fascist movement that was pretty popular in Mexico. But just because Mexico was anti-Nazi didn't mean that it was pro-Jewish immigration. So we watched a film. We watched that film on the St. Louis. We're going to finish watching it. So I'm going to stop that screen share and go back to the film because we're going to see a little bit of history about Mexico now. Can everybody see this?
Could I say something?
In August 1940, the SS Kwanzaa sailed from Lisbon to New York, carrying more than 300 passengers. Most were Jewish refugees. Europe had been at war for nearly a year, and it was getting even harder for refugees to cross the Atlantic Ocean. 200 Kwanzaa passengers who held U.S. immigration visas disembarked in New York. The remaining passengers, who did not have U.S. visas, continued to Veracruz, Mexico. Mexico, however, claimed that at least 80 of the passengers did not have the right paperwork. Their admission was denied. When the Kwanzaa's passengers realized that the ship would stop in Norfolk, Virginia to refuel before returning to Lisbon, they sent frantic telegrams to family members, Jewish organizations, and the U.S. government. Eleanor Roosevelt expressed her personal interest in the fate of the refugees. One family on board hired Jacob Morwitz, a local Virginia attorney, who sued the shipping company for failing to deliver the passengers to their intended destination. Many other passengers also filed suits. A federal judge ordered the ship to stay in Norfolk while Morwitz's case was reviewed by the court. While the ship waited in Norfolk, the State Department investigated the remaining passengers. All were allowed to disembark in the United States. The Kwanzaa passengers sent letters of gratitude to the State Department and the White House, including flowers for the First Lady. But Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long was angry about being forced to admit refugees from the Kwanzaa. He made it clear to U.S. consulates in Europe that the State Department would not tolerate any further incidents in the future.
Okay, so in the interest of time, we don't have a lot of time, and I know I kept you on for a while. The rest of that video just lasted not even a half a minute more, and it shows how you see less and less ships coming over because the consular offices are closing. The war begins, less people are able to leave. But it does show that over 100,000 refugees in a 3-year period were able to come into the United States through New York alone. You know, we have to also remember the other ports of entry for refugees. I'm from El Paso, Texas originally, and I know that many first went to Mexico and then came in through El Paso or Galveston, for example, took in a lot of refugees. So just moving ahead here, Mexico in its immigration policy, Mexico also had a nationalist attitude. Even though they were more liberal and secular, they had this vision of themselves as a mestizo nation. What it means to be mestizo is somebody who is of half Spanish and half native descent. I'm mestizo myself. And so this is a picture of what a mestizo would look like. Somebody who's probably got different features, features that we might associate more with Mexico, young, strong, robust. This is the cry of war. That's what this is saying right here. And this was produced in 1942. Mexico was kind of on the fence between whether it should enter the war or not and which side, because there was a great deal of propaganda in Mexico for the Allies and the Axis powers trying to get Mexico, because it had such great natural resources, to be on their side. And what happens was a boat was torpedoed, a Mexican boat was torpedoed by a German boat there were many German boats along the Pacific, which made it another reason why it was so hard for refugees to come over. It was dangerous. And so Mexico goes to the side of the Allies after this, and that's what this is in response to. So when we look at refuge, I'm going to go back just one right here. This young man, I mentioned earlier that it was legally, it was impossible to leave Germany or to leave German-occupied Europe. But this young man in November of 1941, Nicholas Bodek, is given a visa to come to Mexico by a man named Gilberto Vosquez. Gilberto Vosquez was a German consul general posted in Marseille, who had fought in the Mexican Revolution. He was a leftist. He was a friend of President Cárdenas. Marseille was in the Vichy portion of France, so it was considered to not be under occupation, although we know, of course, the history is much more complicated than that. The Vichy government still had diplomatic relations with Mexico. So if you were able to get to Marseille, it was one of those last places that you could get to, that you could, if you were fortunate enough to find passage on a boat, you could leave. What happens with Vosquez is the Germans come and arrest him, and they put him under house arrest to stop what he's doing, because he did issue thousands of visas, largely to Spanish Republicans, because that's really those are the refugees Mexico wants. They want to honor those who have fought for democratic principles, similar to the principles they fought for in the Mexican Revolution. But we know that many Jewish refugees left Germany and Austria when the Spanish Civil War began, because they went to fight alongside the Spanish Republicans against Franco. So some of them were able to secure visas from Vosquez because they had fought alongside the Spanish Republicans to go to Mexico. And he did help certain families. He's not recognized by Yad Vashem. You won't find him there because there is controversy about Vosquez, if he had taken money or not. But here's a picture of Vosquez arriving in Mexico City. He was released from house arrest after negotiations between Germany and Mexico. And many of the people who are welcoming him are those very refugees that he helped to save. So in closing, we're going to watch this short clip of testimony of a woman named Nellie Wolf. Nellie Wolf was a child from Vienna, Jewish, and she talks about how her family was given visas by Vosquez. And the other thing she talks about is her perception of Mexico. What did she hear about Mexico? Here she is, she's from Vienna, she doesn't speak Spanish, she's never met anybody who's Mexican, she's only heard certain things about Mexico, but that's where she's going to go with her family. And she talks about the boat ride across the Atlantic to go to Veracruz, Mexico, and being on the boat with other refugees who happen to be Spaniards. So we're going to go on ahead and listen to her testimony. It's very short, and then we'll take some questions.
There was this Mexican consul in Marseille called Gilberto Vosquez. He used to be, I think he was the Minister of the Interior in the Cárdenas time in Mexico, and then he became a consul. And he had left this tendency, so he helped the socialists who were trying to leave and come into Mexico. He helped many Spaniards. Only a few years ago, there was a big meeting to inaugurate the bust that was made with the contribution of people who he helped to save. The bust is still there in the Trotsky Museum. You can go and see it if you like. So he lived up to the age of 103, I was told, and died only a few years ago, 1 or 2 years ago.
He was someone who helped a lot of Jews to leave France.
Not only Jews, he helped lots of Spaniards too. What I remember is that the Spaniards would go on the deck and sing and dance and whatever. And I just watch and say, my God, that's a language I had never heard. I'm going to speak that in Mexico.
What were you told about where you were going, and how did you feel about it?
Information was very scarce and misleading. We were told that there were Indians with arrows and bows and whatever. There was lots of oil and silver. Period. That was all the information we had about Mexico. And but we were told, of course, that Spanish was spoken here, and I just listened to those people and wouldn't understand much. But I liked their dancing and their singing. They were much happier than the German-speaking people.
That concludes, oops, I think, am I muted? No. Okay, that does conclude my portion. And I want to thank you for listening. I know it's been a long talk. We covered a lot and there's still so much more, but I'm happy to take your questions or your comments. So you can unmute yourself, and let me see first if there are any questions in the chat. Well, thank you for the kind comments. And yeah, I'm very happy to share this information with you all. And again, I want to thank Ron for asking me to do this because it's very meaningful. I'm pretty passionate about this topic. My family was touched by a lot of this, not Jewish, but the Spanish Republican side. And there's still so much to unpack in this history. So thank you.
Howard has a question there.
Okay, Howard has a question. What was the official position of many Latin American governments about extraditing known Nazi leadership? There wasn't really much. It was actually, if you look at some of the smaller countries, they seem to do a better job, like Central American countries. But for the most part, the extradition kind of came from outside forces. And yes, you did see some of the big ones extradited, but it was done through very nefarious means. I mean, the most famous case would be Eichmann in 1961, who had to be kidnapped by the Mossad. I mean, basically, Argentina didn't know that they were there and that they were going to do this. And that caused a humongous rift that's still felt to this day. That turned Argentina for a time against Israel because it felt like Israel had violated their sovereignty. You saw the extradition happening later, but it was really because of a lot of publicity. When I went to Bariloche in Argentina, and we did some workshops there, this is about 10 years ago. I spent a month working with them, training teachers. And there was a lot of anger about us being there because there's a large German ethnic community in Bariloche, and that's where many of the perpetrators have gone. Erich Prifka, probably the most famous of them. It took international justice and trials to take him out of Argentina and bring him back, where he was in Rome under house arrest when he passed away not too long ago.
I have a something that you said that I think that a little different than what we perceive, because you said 100,000 people were able to come between 38 and 41.
To the United States.
Yeah, to the United States.
Yes.
And
yes.
but why is it? What was the story with St. Louis though? If all those ships were coming, what happened was the St. Louis?
Well, because the St. Louis, there were other people in line for visas ahead of the passengers of the St. Louis. And that was the official kind of position, like you have to wait your turn. There are others ahead of you. So they were in the queue, but life had become too dangerous for many of the passengers to wait in Europe, so they went to Cuba. Remember that they only came to the United States because they were refused entry in Cuba. Their original intent was not to come to the US at first. It was to wait in Cuba until they were brought over. And we have to be very careful about the St. Louis because we judge the St. Louis in hindsight because we know the outcome. And remember in May and June of 1939, nobody knew what was going to happen by 45. It's not an excuse, but we have to remember, and actually in the newspapers, when the St. Louis went back to Europe, it was seen as a happy ending because none of them had to go back to the German Reich. They were taken in by other countries. But again, we didn't have that hindsight to know what was going to happen to them. So that's why we say, look at the complex history of this to understand all of the different facets of this history, to understand immigration history. It wasn't just outright, and also that's why we show the Kwanzaa, because why were the Kwanzaa passengers allowed to stay? And you have to look at the context of the time. So I strongly suggest that you all watch the video. You can watch it again. It's on our website. Just type in refugee ships at sea, USHMM, and it will come up. And you can see, you can watch this history. And it contextualizes why they were not taken in and then why the Kwanzaa passengers were. Does anybody have any other questions?
Well, I mean, could I ask something?
Sure.
Well, number one, about the Kwanzaa ship, but look at all the effort it took to allow those people to come in, the lawsuits and the the fights to have them come in. And then who was it? Long, Breckenridge?
Yes, Breckenridge Long.
Never again, this is going to happen again. So it's not that, it was this thing that, oh yes, come on in, stay in. It was
Right.
a lot of opposition for one thing.
I'm glad you said that, Sylvia, because we have to look at all of the elements. I mean, to hire an attorney, you need to have money. You need to have support. You need to have somebody who's going to listen to you. I mean, it took a lot of maneuvering. Some of the passengers on the Kwanzaa knew people in Virginia who could help them, who could then secure this attorney. But every situation is just so different. I mean, obviously you can see I'm fascinated with the Blumenstein family story. And it took a lot of digging through other archives. There wasn't just one archive. I had to go through the others to find out, well, what happened to this boat and why did they get to stay and what really happened in Venezuela? And I was asked to talk about Venezuela a few weeks ago because that family, the man who intervened for the Königstein, they ended up moving to Miami and they're still a very prominent family today. So they can fill in some of the blanks for me too. I think Alejandro has his hand up.
Oh, yes. Hey, thanks for all information. I'm coming from different background in Latin America, from Argentina and Peru. And the period of time in 1938, for example, is, I would say, a very conflicted one in terms of coming from dictators, not dictators, but coup d'etat. In 1938 was Ortiz, who was the first, I would say, civil government. I wonder why, I don't have an idea, why that letter was addressed prohibiting or make more difficult for the community to come to Argentina. There are some other points there. For example, fascism was very important at the time. The Buenos Aires government was in that way. But I'm wondering why Ortiz? Do you have any suggestion or light about that? Sorry for my question.
Yes, there's a lot of information. I don't, if you're familiar with Haim Avni, he wrote an excellent book on Argentina. I recommend that you read that. I'll I'll write his name in the chat box.
Yes, perfect.
Haim Avni. Also Uki Gonyi, his book, The Real Odessa.
Yeah, the Odessa, yes.
Yes. So Directive 11, which prohibited Jewish immigration, that was a result, Alejandro, of the fear of the Evian conference, that they were going to be asked to take in more refugees. So they sent that out, because even though they went to the Evian conference kind of trying to appear like, oh yes, we're here, so therefore we care, in the background, a lot of it had to do also with the depression. Argentina, you know, it was a very, the economy, the fear of losing jobs to white collar workers, to refugees who had these high qualifications. And if Argentina was going to take them in, just as it had done before, they wanted them to go out to like the Pampas and out to the areas where most of them didn't have that kind of job training. But that's why you have Bolivia. That's why it's important to look at Bolivia, because refugees who were able to get into Argentina, many of them went through Bolivia. But it was largely because of anti-Semitism, this very pro-Catholic view that Argentina should be a Catholic country, which of course will play a role after the war, which goes back to what Howard was asking. It was a lot of anti-Semitism. It was the fear of losing jobs, and just the fear of not being able to support more refugees coming in, which was the same fear that the US had. But read those two, look up The Real Odessa and then Haim Avni's book, which escapes me. But we have a lot of information in our archives from Argentina. We go to Argentina often.
Excellent.
So thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Alejandro. Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I just wanted to see if there were any other questions.
I suppose go back, I'm sorry, on this immigration policy, because I think it's important in terms of our perception. We see that Breckinridge Long and others were, I mean, he was opposed to giving visas to Jews.
Yes.
And he's seen it within the State Department. So how did that work out?
It just depends. I'm not an expert. My colleague Becky Erbelding is the expert more on the American refugee policy.
Okay.
But I do want to answer that question, because a lot of it is really the shift in what we know and the shift in the war. And from what we see at the end of the video, I mean, he was not somebody who was friendly toward Jewish immigration for various reasons. And by that point, in the latter part of the war, you have this shift of fear of refugees, because they're going to be a drain, an economic drain. And we are going through, by that point, we were out of the Depression, but we were heading back into a recession before the war. And now there's a fear that they're going to be a security threat, a national security threat, that they're going to be spies. So I strongly recommend, if you are interested in learning more about Breckinridge Long and US policy, you should read my colleague, Becky Erbelding, Dr. Becky Erbelding's book, Rescue Board.
I'm sorry, can you say again?
Rescue Board.
Rescue Board, BORID?
Yeah, I'm putting it in the chat.
Oh, okay, thank you.
We also have a lot on our website too. We have a lot of articles in our encyclopedia, Holocaust Encyclopedia online. We have a slew of articles on refuge and immigration to the United States.
Could you repeat Rebecca's last name?
It's in the chat.
It's on the chat.
The name got cut off in the chat.
It's ERBELDING. Rescue. ERBELDING. Erbelding.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a new book, or it's been out for a while?
It's been out for a couple of years. She gave a book talk. I don't know if you were to the Czech partners about a year ago.
I must have missed it.
Yeah, she gave a talk and the book won a couple of awards too. And she speaks often. So I recommend that you invite her.
Yeah, I'd love to have her come.
Yes,
She
she's
works-
awesome.
She works for the museum.
Yes.
Oh, good. We'll contact her.
Yeah.
Be good. Anyway, I don't know if anybody has thank you so much, Christina.
Well, thank you.
And I saw in the chat that many people have very much appreciated your talk. So, and
Absolutely.
it will
Thank
be, available for people to see again.
Good.
So, thank you, and thank you to the museum for all the great work that you and everybody else there does.
Well, thank you. I thank you again for this invitation and good luck to everybody. I hope that that everybody stays healthy and well. And if you choose to get the vaccine or not, I hope that your lives can go back to normal as much as possible. I hope that for all of us.
Good. Will we have another reunion a Czech reunion at some point?
I don't know. I would love to have one. Well, Becky spoke at the Czech reunion. You met Becky. You heard her speak.
Oh, I guess I did. You're right.
Yeah,
Now I
you did.
remember that.
She
Yeah.
spoke. She gave the overview of the Americans in Holocaust exhibit.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding
So
me.
thank you to everybody.
All
Have a
right.
good
Thank you.
evening.
Have a good
Take care.
evening. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you. Bye-bye.
you.
Oh, I
Take
wanted
care.
to ask, is the museum closed, did you say?
Yes, the museum's closed. We don't know when we're going to reopen.
Oh, you don't know?